July 15, 1990. It was a sweltering Sunday afternoon in Stone Mountain, Georgia, a suburb just east of Atlanta. The kind of summer day where the heat rises in waves off the pavement, and everyone seeks refuge in air conditioning. At an apartment complex on Tree Hills Parkway, neighbors were going about their Sunday routines when a frantic knock shattered the quiet. A woman, bleeding and barely able to stand, had made it to a neighbor's door. Her name was Pamela Sumpter. She was 43 years old, and she'd just been through an unimaginable nightmare. She'd been raped. She'd been stabbed multiple times. And her brother John, who lived with her in the apartment next door, had been attacked too. She didn't know if he was alive or dead. When DeKalb County police officers arrived minutes later, they found a crime scene that would haunt them for decades. John Sumpter, age 46, lay dead in the apartment he shared with his sister, stabbed to death in what appeared to be a brutal, frenzied attack. The phone lines had been cut, preventing anyone from calling for help. And despite Pamela's courage in providing officers with a detailed description of her attacker, before she succumbed to her injuries 3 weeks later, the case would go cold for 35 years. This is the story of how cutting-edge DNA technology, a federal grant, and an untested rape kit from 1990 finally brought justice to the Sumpter family in 2024, and how the arrest of a man living just one county away shocked a community that had waited more than 3 decades for answers. When DeKalb County Police Department officers responded to that call on Tree Hills Parkway on July 15, 1990, they knew immediately they were dealing with something horrific. Pamela Sumpter had managed to escape her attacker and make it to a neighbor's apartment, but she was in critical condition. She'd been stabbed multiple times, and she told officers through her pain that she'd also been sexually assaulted. But her first concern wasn't for herself, it was for her brother John. "My brother," she told the officers. "He's in the apartment. He was stabbed too. I think he might be dead." Officers rushed to the apartment that Pamela and John shared. What they found inside confirmed Pamela's worst fears. John Sumpter lay on the floor, his body covered in stab wounds. He'd bled out at the scene. The medical examiner would later determine that he'd been stabbed numerous times in a violent, sustained attack. There were signs of a struggle, furniture overturned, blood spattered across the walls and floor. Investigators also discovered that the phone lines to the apartment had been deliberately cut. Whoever had done this had wanted to ensure the siblings couldn't call for help, couldn't reach the outside world. It was a calculated, cold-blooded detail that suggested premeditation, that suggested the attacker had thought about how to trap his victims. Pamela was rushed to an area hospital, where medical staff worked frantically to stabilize her. Despite her critical injuries, she was conscious and coherent enough to speak with detectives. And what she told them would become the foundation of the investigation for the next 35 years. From her hospital bed, Pamela Sumpter provided investigators with as much detail as she could remember about the attack and the man who had committed it. Her account was clear and specific, even as she fought for her life. She told detectives that the man was someone her brother John had recently met. He was a new acquaintance, someone from Detroit, Michigan, who had recently moved to the Atlanta area. John had spent the day with this man, showing him around the city, helping him get acclimated to his new surroundings. It was just the kind of thing John would do, his family would later say. He was friendly, trusting, always willing to help someone in need. Late that night, John and the man had returned to the apartment. Pamela was still awake when they arrived. She remembered seeing them come in, remembered exchanging brief pleasantries, then going to bed around 11:30 p.m. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, and Pamela had retired to hers, assuming John and his new friend would talk for a while, and then the visitor would leave. But that's not what happened. Pamela told detectives that while the order of events was unclear in her memory, she believed she was attacked first. She woke to find the man in her room. He raped her, then stabbed her multiple times. Through her terror and pain, she heard sounds from elsewhere in the apartment, sounds of a struggle, sounds that made her blood run cold. At some point during or after her attack, Pamela saw her brother John lying on the apartment floor. She couldn't tell if he was alive or dead. Her attacker was still in the apartment. Using every ounce of strength she had left, Pamela managed to escape, to make it to a neighbor's door, to summon help. But even with all this information, Even with Pamela's detailed description of the attacker, investigators couldn't identify him. She didn't know his name. She only knew what John had told her, that he was from Detroit, that he was new to Atlanta, that he and John had just met. It wasn't much to go on. A rape kit was collected from Pamela at the hospital, preserving biological evidence from her attacker. In 1990, DNA analysis was in its infancy. The Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, was just a pilot program at the time. The National DNA Database wouldn't be formalized until 1994 and wouldn't become fully operational until 1998. So the rape kit was carefully preserved, cataloged, and stored, but there was no way to analyze it meaningfully with the technology available at the time. Pamela Sumpter fought for her life for 3 weeks, but on August 5, 1990, she succumbed to her injuries. She died without ever knowing the name of the man who had destroyed her family. The DeKalb County Police Department threw everything they had at the Sumpter case. Detectives interviewed neighbors, tracked down anyone who might have known John Sumpter, tried to identify the man from Detroit that Pamela had described. They reached out to law enforcement in Michigan, asking if anyone matching the description had recently relocated to Georgia. They worked the case hard for months, following every lead, no matter how small. The Sumpter family was devastated. John and Pamela's mother, along with their brother James Sumpter, couldn't comprehend how this had happened. John and Pamela were good people, hardworking, kind, the type of people who would help a stranger without a second thought. And that generosity, that willingness to help someone new to the city, had gotten them killed. The family offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. It was all they could afford, and they hoped desperately that it would motivate someone to come forward with information. But despite the reward, despite the media coverage, despite the intensive police investigation, no credible leads materialized. By early 1991, the case had gone cold. Detectives had exhausted every avenue they could think of. Without a name, without a way to identify the man from Detroit, they had nowhere else to turn. The case file was marked as unsolved and shelved, joining the hundreds of other cold cases in the DeKalb County archives. For the Sumpter family, the pain of not knowing was agonizing. They knew who had killed John and Pamela in broad strokes, a man from Detroit, a new acquaintance. But they didn't know his name, didn't know where he'd gone, didn't know if he was still in Georgia or if he'd left the state. They didn't know if he'd killed again, and they didn't know if they would ever get justice for their loved ones. Years turned into decades. The 1990s gave way to the 2000s, then the 2010s. DNA technology advanced by leaps and bounds, but the Sumpter rape kit sat untested in storage. There were thousands of rape kits across Georgia in the same situation. Evidence from crimes committed before modern DNA analysis became standard practice, sitting in evidence rooms waiting for someone to prioritize them. James Sumpter never gave up hope that someday his sibling's killer would be caught. But as the years stretched on, even he began to wonder if that day would ever come. In the early 2020s, law enforcement agencies across Georgia began making a concerted effort to address the backlog of untested rape kits, particularly those collected before 1999. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, working with funding from the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, started systematically sending these old rape kits to private labs for analysis using modern DNA extraction and sequencing techniques. In November 2022, 32 years after Pamela Sumpter was attacked, the GBI sent her rape kit to Bode Technology, a private forensic lab that specialized in DNA analysis. The evidence had been carefully preserved all those years, stored under conditions designed to prevent degradation. But even with the best storage practices, DNA breaks down over time. The question was whether enough genetic material remained after 3 decades to generate a usable DNA profile. The answer, thankfully, was yes. By February 2023, Bode Technology had successfully extracted and analyzed DNA from the rape kit. They generated a complete male DNA profile, the genetic signature of Pamela Sumpter's attacker. In June 2023, this profile was uploaded into Georgia's statewide DNA database, which was linked to CODIS at the national level. The system searched for matches among convicted offenders, unsolved crimes, and missing persons. At the state level, there were no hits. whoever had raped Pamela Sumpter and murdered her and her brother had never been arrested and convicted in Georgia, or if he had, his DNA had never been collected and entered into the system. But this was just the beginning. The DNA profile was about to unlock a door that had been closed for 35 years. Meanwhile, something else was happening that would prove crucial to solving the Sumpter case. In the spring of 2023, an investigator in the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office named Tiana McClure was conducting an audit of 50 unsolved homicide cases in the county. The audit was part of preparation for applying for a federal grant, specifically designed to help prosecutors reopen cold cases using DNA evidence. McClure identified the Sumpter case as an ideal candidate for the grant. It had everything federal funders were looking for: biological evidence that had been preserved, a detailed victim account that provided investigative leads, and a family that had never stopped seeking justice. The case was tragic, compelling, and most importantly, potentially solvable with modern forensic techniques. In October 2023, the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office received word that their grant application had been approved. They'd been awarded federal funding from the U.S. Department of Justice's Prosecuting Cold Cases Using DNA grant program. The Sumpter case was chosen as one of the first to be actively worked under this new initiative. DeKalb County District Attorney Sherry Boston personally took an interest in the case. A veteran prosecutor who had built her career on seeking justice for victims, Boston saw the Sumpter case as exactly the kind of investigation her office should prioritize. A brutal double murder, decades of family suffering, and now, finally, the tools to potentially solve it. "We never give up on these cases," Boston would later say at a press conference. "Families deserve answers, no matter how long it takes." In February 2024, investigators took the next critical step. They uploaded the DNA profile from Pamela Sumpter's rape kit to the National CODIS database, casting a wider net beyond Georgia. And almost immediately, they got a hit. The DNA matched biological evidence from an unsolved sexual assault case in Detroit, Michigan from 1992, 2 years after the Sumpter murders. The Detroit case had never been prosecuted, but it had been documented and evidence had been preserved. Most importantly, the victim in that case had identified her attacker by name. His name was Kenneth Perry, and he was her ex-boyfriend. When the DeKalb County investigators saw that name, that connection to Detroit, they must have felt their hearts start racing. Pamela Sumpter had told detectives that her attacker was from Detroit. Now they had a name, and it tied directly back to Michigan. By March 2024, the DeKalb County DA's office had obtained the complete case file from Detroit. They learned that Kenneth Perry had a history of violence against women, that he'd been accused of sexual assault by someone who knew him, who could identify him. The Detroit case had never gone to trial for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Perhaps the victim had been too traumatized to proceed. Perhaps there hadn't been enough corroborating evidence at the time. But the accusation and the evidence had remained in the system. Investigators began searching for Kenneth Perry. They started with the name and birth date from the Detroit case file. And what they found was shocking. A man with the exact same name and birth date was living in Loganville, Georgia, in Gwinnett County, just one county away from where the Sumpter siblings had been murdered 34 years earlier. Kenneth Perry had been living less than 30 miles from the crime scene for decades. He'd been there the whole time, living an ordinary life, going to work, coming home, while the Sumpter family suffered without answers, while James Sumpter mourned his brother and sister, wondering if their killer would ever be found. But investigators needed to be absolutely certain. The name and birth date match was compelling, but they needed definitive proof that the Kenneth Perry living in Loganville was the same Kenneth Perry from the Detroit assault, and that he was the man whose DNA had been found on Pamela Sumpter's body. This is where the case entered cutting-edge territory. The DeKalb County DA's office partnered with Othram, a Texas-based private laboratory that specialized in forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer and solve hundreds of other cold cases across the country. Forensic genetic genealogy works by uploading DNA profiles to public genealogy databases, the same databases that regular people use when they submit samples to services like Ancestry.com or 23andMe to learn about their family history. While major commercial DNA companies restrict law enforcement access to their databases, Many users choose to upload their results to open-source databases like GEDmatch, where they can find more distant relatives. When a suspect's DNA is uploaded to these databases, it returns matches to anyone who shares segments of DNA with the suspect, typically third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor several generations back. Investigators then work with professional genealogists to build family trees, tracing relationships backward to find common ancestors, then forward through generations to identify living descendants who match the age, geographic location, and other characteristics of the person they're looking for. In April 2024, Othram performed this analysis on the DNA from Pamela Sumpter's rape kit. They identified several genealogical matches in public databases, people who were distant relatives of whoever had left that biological evidence 34 years earlier. Working with these matches, Othram's genealogists constructed family trees and traced the connections. The results were definitive. The genealogical matches formed a family network that included Kenneth Perry. It wasn't absolute proof on its own. Genetic genealogy can narrow a suspect pool, but can't make a positive identification without a direct DNA comparison. But it provided the confirmation investigators needed to move forward. Everything pointed to Kenneth Perry of Loganville, the Detroit connection, the name match, and now, the genealogical analysis. There was only one step left: obtain a direct DNA sample from Kenneth Perry and compare it to the evidence from the crime scene. On June 6, 2024, 33 years, 10 months, and 22 days after John and Pamela Sumpter were attacked in their Stone Mountain apartment, members of the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office Fugitive Unit executed an arrest warrant at a residence in Loganville. Kenneth Perry, now 55 years old, was taken into custody without incident. He was cooperative during the arrest, showing no signs of resistance. Officers collected a DNA sample from Perry on the spot, a simple cheek swab that would provide the definitive answer everyone had been waiting for. The sample was rushed to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's crime lab for analysis. Technicians extracted Perry's DNA and compared it to the DNA profile from Pamela Sumpter's 1990 rape kit. On June 20, 2024, the results came back. It was a match. A perfect, unequivocal match. The DNA from Kenneth Perry's cheek swab matched the DNA from the rape kit to a degree that made misidentification impossible. The odds of it being anyone else were astronomical, billions to 1. After 35 years, investigators finally had proof of who had raped Pamela Sumpter and murdered her and her brother John. On June 26, 2024, a DeKalb County grand jury indicted Kenneth Perry on 2 counts of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, rape, 4 counts of aggravated assault, 2 counts of aggravated battery, 2 counts of possession of a knife during the commission of a felony, and theft by taking. District Attorney Sherry Boston held a press conference that afternoon to announce the indictment. Standing at a podium flanked by investigators and members of the Sumpter family, Boston explained how the case had been cracked using a combination of preserved evidence, federal funding, cutting-edge DNA technology, and painstaking investigative work. After more than 3 decades, the Sumpter family finally has answers, Boston said, her voice strong and clear. We know who killed John and Pamela, and we're going to make sure he's held accountable. James Sumpter, the victim's brother who had waited 35 years for this moment, spoke briefly to the press. His voice shook with emotion. This world is wicked and evil, he said. But I pray that the justice system prevails on behalf of my brother and sister. The arrest of Kenneth Perry sent shockwaves through both the Stone Mountain community and the city of Loganville, where Perry had been living quietly for years. Neighbors were stunned to learn that the man they knew, someone who attended church and seemed normal, had allegedly committed such brutal crimes decades earlier. But the legal process was just beginning. Perry would have his day in court, a chance to defend himself against the charges. And what happened during that trial would reveal disturbing details about what occurred on that terrible night in July 1990. If you're riveted by this case and want to see justice served, please hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below about how you feel about using genetic genealogy to solve cold cases, and make sure you're subscribed to Untold Case Desk with notifications turned on. We cover the true crime stories that matter, the victims who deserve to be remembered, the families who never stop fighting for answers. Now, let's get into the trial of Kenneth Perry and the disturbing defense he would mount. As investigators dug deeper into Kenneth Perry's background following his arrest, a troubling picture emerged. This wasn't a man who had committed one terrible act and then lived a law-abiding life. Kenneth Perry had a history of violence, particularly violence against women. Court records revealed that Perry had previous convictions, most relating to domestic violence. He'd been accused of assaulting intimate partners, of controlling and abusive behavior. The unprosecuted 1992 Detroit sexual assault case, where the victim had identified him as her ex-boyfriend, fit a clear pattern. Perry targeted women he knew, women who trusted him or were vulnerable to him. Perry had moved to the Atlanta area sometime around 1990, relocating from Detroit. Prosecutors believed he'd met John Sumpter shortly after arriving in Georgia. John, described by his family as friendly and generous to a fault, had apparently offered to show Perry around, to help him get acclimated to his new city. It was an act of kindness that would cost John and his sister their lives. After the murders, Perry had remained in the Georgia area, eventually settling in Loganville in Gwinnett County. He worked as a maintenance worker and, according to some who knew him, was involved in ministry work, helping others through a church program. Friends and acquaintances who gave statements during his trial described him as caring and generous, someone who seemed committed to helping people. But prosecutors saw a different picture. A man who presented one face to the world while hiding a dark capacity for violence, particularly sexual violence. A man who had literally gotten away with murder for 35 years, who had gone on with his life while the Sumpter family suffered, never knowing who had destroyed their family. Kenneth Perry's trial began on March 3, 2025, in DeKalb County Superior Court. Judge Shondina C. Morris presided over the case, which would last just over a week. The courtroom was packed with members of the Sumpter family, local residents who remembered the 1990 murders, and journalists covering what had become one of Georgia's most high-profile cold case prosecutions. The prosecution was led by Senior Assistant District Attorney Shannon Hodder, an experienced prosecutor with a reputation for thoroughness and aggressive courtroom tactics. Hodder's strategy was straightforward: present the DNA evidence, walk the jury through the timeline of the investigation, and show how modern science had definitively identified Kenneth Perry as the perpetrator. Hodder called a series of witnesses to establish what had happened on July 15, 1990. Retired police officers who had responded to the scene testified about finding Pamela Sumpter bleeding and terrified at a neighbor's apartment, about discovering John Sumpter's body in the apartment next door, about the cut phone lines that had prevented the siblings from calling for help. Medical examiners explained the nature of the injuries both victims had sustained. John had been stabbed multiple times in a sustained attack. Pamela had been raped and stabbed, her injuries so severe that despite receiving medical care, she had died 3 weeks after the assault. The testimony was graphic, disturbing, and painted a picture of extreme violence. Then came the scientific evidence. Forensic experts from Bodie Technology, the GBI, and Othram took the stand to explain how DNA had been extracted from the 34-year-old rape kit, how it had been analyzed and uploaded to databases, how the match to the Detroit case had been made, and how genetic genealogy had confirmed Kenneth Perry as a suspect. Finally, they presented the comparison between Perry's DNA and the DNA from the crime scene. Charts and graphs showed the genetic markers, the points of comparison, the statistical probability of the match. The expert testified that the odds of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Kenneth Perry were approximately 1 in several billion, essentially impossible. This DNA, the expert told the jury, pointing to the comparison chart, came from Kenneth Perry. There is no scientific doubt about that. Kenneth Perry's defense was handled by public defender Darrell Queen, who faced an uphill battle given the strength of the DNA evidence. Queen didn't dispute that Perry had been in the Sumpter apartment that night. The DNA evidence made that undeniable. Instead, he tried to construct an alternative narrative of what had happened. On March 10, 2025, Kenneth Perry took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that defense attorneys often counsel against, but one that Perry apparently insisted upon. What he said from that witness stand shocked everyone in the courtroom. Perry testified that he had indeed gone to the Sumpter apartment with John Sumpter that night. But according to Perry, he was the victim, not the perpetrator. He claimed that John Sumpter and another unidentified man had drugged him, had sexually assaulted him while he was incapacitated. He said he woke up confused and disoriented, that he fled the apartment in fear, and that all three people, John, Pamela, and the mysterious third man, were alive when he left. "I didn't rape nobody," Perry insisted from the stand. "I didn't kill nobody. All three of these people were alive when I left out of that house that night." It was a stunning accusation, one that attempted to shift the narrative entirely. But there were immediate problems with Perry's story. First, there was no evidence of any third person at the scene. Police had thoroughly processed the apartment and found no indication that anyone other than John, Pamela, and Perry had been there. Second, Perry's story didn't explain the physical evidence. If he'd been the victim of an assault and had fled in fear, why was his DNA found in the rape kit collected from Pamela Sumpter? Why had Pamela told police that she'd been raped and that the attacker was the man John had brought to the apartment? Third, Perry had never reported being assaulted. He'd never gone to police, never sought medical attention, never told anyone about what he claimed had happened to him until 35 years later when he was on trial for murder. Prosecutor Shannon Hodder was scathing in her cross-examination of Perry. She called his testimony a disgusting story that contradicted all the physical evidence and the dying declaration of Pamela Sumpter. She methodically dismantled his account, pointing out inconsistencies, highlighting the implausibility of his claims, emphasizing that he was making these accusations against people who couldn't defend themselves because they were dead. Defense attorney Queen, in his closing arguments, acknowledged the difficulty of his position. He called the killings tragic and brutal, but maintained that his client was innocent, that the evidence didn't prove Perry had committed rape or murder, only that he'd been present. But the jury wasn't buying it. On March 11, 2025, after deliberating for just over 2 hours, the jury returned to the courtroom with their verdict. The speed of their deliberation suggested they'd found the prosecution's case overwhelming and the defense's alternative narrative unconvincing. Judge Morris called the court to order and asked the jury foreman if they'd reached a verdict. The foreman confirmed they had and then read the results. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. 2 counts of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, rape, 4 counts of aggravated assault, 2 counts of aggravated battery, 2 counts of possession of a knife during the commission of a felony, theft by taking. Kenneth Perry showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read. He sat still, his expression blank, as if he was somewhere else entirely. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder, but Perry didn't respond. In the gallery, members of the Sumpter family wept. James Sumpter, who had waited 35 years for this moment, put his face in his hands. Their brother and sister's killer had finally been held accountable. District Attorney Sherry Boston held a press conference immediately after the verdict was announced. Standing before a bank of microphones and cameras, she spoke directly about what the conviction meant. "While we are satisfied with the verdict, make no mistake, this verdict was not just for me or my office," Boston said, her voice strong and clear. "The jury's verdict today was for Pamela, John, and the entire Sumpter family. A family that has waited decades for their loved one's murderer to be brought to justice." Boston emphasized that this case represented the first successful prosecution under the DA's newly funded cold case DNA initiative, and she hoped it would serve as a model for solving other decades-old unsolved murders. "We never give up on victims," she said. "No matter how much time has passed, no matter how cold the case has become, we will continue to seek justice. And as this case shows, modern science gives us tools that didn't exist when these crimes were committed. There are other families out there waiting for answers. This conviction gives them hope." Kenneth Perry's sentencing hearing was scheduled for March 18, 2025, 1 week after his conviction. Georgia law required a separate sentencing hearing where both the prosecution and the victims' families would have an opportunity to make impact statements before the judge imposed sentence. The sentencing hearing was emotionally devastating. James Sumpter, speaking on behalf of his family, addressed the court and spoke directly to Kenneth Perry. "I have no malice or hatred for Mr. Perry," James said, his voice shaking with emotion. "But he must pay the consequences for this evil, gruesome murder he committed. No one really wins in this murder, because I lost a brother and sister, and no matter what we do, nothing will bring them back." The victim's elderly mother also gave a statement. She described John as ambitious, someone she'd shared a close bond with, someone who had so much potential. She described Pamela as a woman with a wonderful smile and a sharp mind, someone who lit up every room she entered. We can only wonder about the incredible lives they would have led, if not stopped by your evil actions, Mr. Perry, she said, looking directly at the defendant. Several of Perry's friends and associates also spoke, offering a different perspective on the man they knew. They described him as caring and generous, someone who had worked in ministry to help others, who seemed committed to doing good in the world. It was a stark contrast to the portrait painted by the prosecution, and it highlighted the question that often arises in cases like this. How can someone present such a normal face to the world while hiding such capacity for violence? Perry himself spoke briefly during the sentencing hearing. His first words since testifying during the trial. "I would just like to offer my sympathy and condolences to the Sumpter family," he said quietly. But Senior Assistant District Attorney Shannon Hodder wasn't satisfied with Perry's statement. She pointed out that Perry had shown no genuine remorse for his crimes, that his testimony during trial had been an attempt to smear his victims and avoid responsibility, and that his sympathy and condolences rang hollow given his refusal to accept accountability. Hodder also informed the court about Perry's previous convictions, most relating to domestic violence, establishing a pattern of abusive behavior toward women that stretched back decades. She argued that Perry represented a continued danger, and that the court should impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. Judge Shondina C. Morris listened to all the statements carefully. Then, in a firm, clear voice, she delivered her decision. Kenneth Perry was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences plus 100 additional years in prison. The consecutive nature of the sentences meant Perry would never be eligible for parole. He would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. The evidence in this case was overwhelming, Judge Morris said. You committed heinous crimes against 2 innocent people. You took their lives in a brutal, violent manner, and then you lived freely for 35 years while their family suffered. This sentence ensures you will never walk free again. Perry was immediately remanded to the custody of the Georgia Department of Corrections, where he would be transferred to a maximum security prison to begin serving his sentence. The conviction and sentencing of Kenneth Perry represented a watershed moment for cold case investigations in Georgia. It was the first case successfully prosecuted under the federal grant program specifically designed to use DNA evidence to solve decades-old crimes, and it demonstrated the power of combining traditional investigative work with cutting-edge forensic science. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence, even when that evidence can't be analyzed with current technology. Pamela Sumpter's rape kit, collected in 1990 when DNA analysis was in its infancy, had been carefully stored for 35 years. That foresight, that decision to preserve biological evidence even without the immediate means to analyze it, ultimately led to justice for the Sumpter family. District Attorney Sherry Boston emphasized this point in interviews after the trial. Evidence preservation is absolutely critical, she said. We never know what technology will be available in the future. What seems unanalyzable today might be the key to solving a case tomorrow. The Sumpter case also joined a growing list of Georgia cold cases solved using forensic genetic genealogy. By early 2025, Othram's work had helped identify suspects or victims in 17 different Georgia cases. The technology, which had seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier, had become a standard tool in cold case investigations. For James Sumpter and his family, the conviction brought a complex mix of emotions. There was relief, finally knowing that their loved one's killer had been caught and would never harm anyone else. There was satisfaction in seeing the justice system work, even if it had taken 35 years. But there was also profound sadness, knowing that John and Pamela would never come back, that 35 years of their lives had been defined by this unsolved tragedy. At least we have some closure now, James told reporters after the sentencing. We know what happened, we know who did it, and we know he'll never get out of prison. It doesn't bring them back, but it's something. In all the discussion of DNA technology, genetic genealogy, and cold case investigations, it's crucial that we don't lose sight of who John and Pamela Sumpter were as people. They weren't just victims in a case file. They were real people with families who loved them, with dreams and aspirations, with lives that were cut tragically short. John Sumpter was 46 years old when he died. His family described him as ambitious and friendly, someone who was always willing to help others. That generosity, that willingness to show a newcomer around his city, ultimately cost him his life. But it also spoke to who he was as a person, someone who saw the good in people, who extended kindness, even to strangers. Pamela Sumpter was 43. Her family remembered her smile, her sharp mind, her vibrant personality. She fought for her life for 3 weeks after the attack, and during that time, despite her pain and trauma, she provided police with crucial information about her attacker. Her courage, her determination to help catch the man who had done this, ultimately helped solve the case 35 years later when that information was combined with modern DNA evidence. The Sumpter siblings left behind a mother, a brother, extended family, and friends who mourned them for more than 3 decades. They left behind questions that haunted their loved ones, gaps in the family that could never be filled. And they left behind a community that remembered them and never forgot the terrible crime that had taken them away. The Sumpter case represents more than just one family's long journey to justice. It illuminates broader issues about how the criminal justice system handles sexual assault evidence, how cold cases are prioritized, and how advances in forensic science can reach back through decades to solve seemingly unsolvable crimes. At the time of Perry's conviction in 2025, Georgia still had thousands of untested rape kits sitting in evidence storage facilities across the state. These kits, some dating back to the 1980s and 1990s, represented thousands of victims whose cases had never been fully investigated, whose attackers had never been identified or prosecuted. The Sumpter case demonstrated what was possible when resources were dedicated to testing this backlog. Following Perry's conviction, advocacy groups in Georgia renewed their calls for comprehensive rape kit testing. They pointed to the Sumpter case as proof that even decades-old evidence could yield results, that victims and families deserved to have this evidence analyzed no matter how much time had passed. Every one of those untested kits represents a person who was victimized, said one advocate at a press conference following the verdict. Everyone represents a potential perpetrator who could still be brought to justice. The Sumpter case shows us that it's never too late to pursue these cases. The case also highlighted the power and the controversy surrounding forensic genetic genealogy. While law enforcement and prosecutors praised the technique as a breakthrough tool for solving cold cases, privacy advocates raised concerns about the implications of using consumer DNA databases for law enforcement purposes. When people submit their DNA to genealogy services, they're typically looking to learn about their ancestry or find biological relatives. Most don't realize that by uploading their results to open-source databases like GED Match, they might be helping law enforcement identify distant relatives as suspects in crimes. Some privacy advocates argued this represented an invasion of privacy, that people's genetic information was being used in ways they never consented to. Supporters of the technology countered that only open-source databases, where users explicitly agreed to share their information, were used, that no one's genetic privacy was being violated without consent. They also pointed out that genetic genealogy only identified potential suspects. It didn't prove guilt. Direct DNA comparison was still required to make a definitive match, and suspects still had full due process rights. The debate continues, but the results are undeniable. Since the Golden State Killer case in 2018, forensic genetic genealogy has been used to solve hundreds of cold cases across the United States. Families who had given up hope of ever getting answers have finally learned the truth. Killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder have been caught decades later, and the technology continues to improve, making it possible to extract usable DNA from increasingly degraded or contaminated evidence. The investigation and prosecution of Kenneth Perry offers several important lessons for law enforcement, prosecutors, and the broader criminal justice system. First, evidence preservation is absolutely critical. The decision to carefully store Pamela Sumpter's rape kit in 1990, even though the technology to fully analyze it didn't exist at the time, ultimately made it possible to solve the case 35 years later. Evidence that seems unanalyzable today might become the key to solving a case tomorrow as technology advances. Second, Cold cases should never be considered permanently closed. The Sumpter case sat dormant for decades, but it was always solvable. It just needed the right combination of technology, resources, and investigative attention. The creation of dedicated cold case units and the allocation of federal funding for DNA testing have proven essential to bringing justice in decades-old crimes. Third, victim statements and witness accounts remain crucial even in the age of DNA evidence. Pamela Sumpter's description of her attacker as someone from Detroit who had recently met her brother provided a critical investigative lead that helped confirm Perry's identity when the DNA match to the Detroit case came back. Without that contextual information, investigators might have had a harder time connecting the dots. Fourth, advances in forensic science can overcome the limitations that hampered investigations in the past. In 1990, DNA analysis was in its infancy. Investigators had biological evidence, but no way to meaningfully analyze it. By 2024, not only could they extract and analyze DNA from 34-year-old evidence, they could use genetic genealogy to identify suspects even when there was no direct match in criminal databases. The tools available to solve crimes have become exponentially more powerful. Finally, the case demonstrates the importance of never giving up on victims and their families. James Sumpter waited 35 years for justice for his brother and sister. Investigators who worked the case never forgot about John and Pamela, even as years turned into decades. When the opportunity came to reopen the case with new technology and resources, they pursued it aggressively. That persistence, that refusal to let the case be forgotten, ultimately brought a killer to justice. As of 2025, Kenneth Perry remains incarcerated in the Georgia Department of Corrections, serving his 3 consecutive life sentences plus 100 years. At 56 years old, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. He has the right to appeal his conviction. But given the overwhelming DNA evidence and the strength of the prosecution's case, any appeal faces long odds. The DeKalb County District Attorney's Office, emboldened by the success of the Sumpter prosecution, has continued to work through other cold cases using the federal grant funding. Several additional cases are under active investigation, with DNA evidence being tested and analyzed. While DA Boston has not released specific details about these ongoing investigations, she has indicated that her office is committed to pursuing justice in every solvable cold case. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation continues to work through the backlog of untested rape kits from the 1980s and 1990s. Thousands of kits remain, but progress is being made. Each kit that gets tested represents a chance to identify a perpetrator, to bring closure to a victim, to solve a case that might have seemed hopeless. Othram and other forensic genetic genealogy labs continue to partner with law enforcement agencies across Georgia and the nation, working to identify suspects and unidentified victims in cold cases. The technology continues to improve, allowing analysts to extract usable DNA from increasingly challenging samples. For the Sumpter family, life goes on, forever changed by the events of July 1990, but finally, with some measure of closure. James Sumpter told reporters after the trial that while nothing could bring back his brother and sister, knowing that their killer had been caught and would spend the rest of his life in prison gave him peace. "I can finally visit their graves without that heavy weight on my heart," he said. "I can tell them that we never forgot, that we never stopped looking, and that we finally got justice for them." The murders of John and Pamela Sumpter in July 1990 were brutal, senseless crimes that devastated a family and haunted a community. For 35 years, their killer walked free, living less than 30 miles from where he had committed his crimes, while the Sumpter family suffered without answers. But through the dedication of cold case investigators, the allocation of federal funding for DNA testing, advances in forensic science, and the courage of a victim who provided crucial information, even as she lay dying, justice finally came. Kenneth Perry was identified, arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. He will never walk free again. This case demonstrates that no matter how much time has passed, no matter how cold a case has become, justice is still possible. DNA evidence that sits untested for decades can still yield results. Genetic genealogy can identify suspects even when there are no matches in criminal databases, and families who have waited years or even decades for answers can still get closure. For every cold case that gets solved, there are families who finally get to grieve fully, knowing the truth. There are victims whose stories are finally told, whose attackers are finally held accountable. And there are communities that see that the criminal justice system, despite its flaws and delays, can still deliver justice. The story of John and Pamela Sumpter is a tragedy, but it's also a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of preserving evidence, and the reality that advances in science can reach back through time to right old wrongs. Their deaths were senseless and brutal, but their case has helped pioneer the use of modern forensic techniques to solve decades-old crimes, giving hope to countless other families still waiting for answers. John Sumpter was 46 years old when his life was stolen. Pamela Sumpter was 43. They were good people who showed kindness to someone who repaid that kindness with violence. They deserved so much better than what happened to them. But after 35 years, they finally got justice. And Kenneth Perry, who thought he had gotten away with murder, learned that time doesn't erase guilt, that evidence preserved carefully can speak across decades, and that justice, even delayed, is still justice. If you or someone you know has been a victim of sexual assault, resources are available. The National Sexual Assault Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-656-HOPE, 4673. You are not alone, and you deserve support and justice. For families dealing with unsolved cases, organizations like the DNA Doe Project, the Vidocq Society, and various cold case foundations work to help solve crimes using modern forensic techniques. Never give up hope that answers may still be found. Thank you for watching this episode of Untold Case Desk. If this story of a 35-year journey to justice moved you, if you believe that victims deserve justice no matter how much time has passed, please hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below telling us your thoughts on using DNA technology to solve cold cases, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you never miss an episode. We cover the cases that matter, the victims who deserve to be remembered, the families who never stop fighting for answers. Until next time, this is Untold Case Desk, reminding you that the truth has a way of surfacing, even after 35 years. Rest in peace, John and Pamela Sumpter. Justice was delayed, but it was not denied.